Woo! Well, you are not going to want to miss this conversation with Laura Silverman. She's the founder of the Sobriety Collective, and she's doing pretty awesome things in the space. She is somebody who got sober young. So for anybody out there who feels like, I'm 20, I'm 21, I'm 22, how the heck can I go through life not drinking alcohol? Laura is going to share her very honest, raw story about how she did it. So buckle up. Here we go.
Here, we want to show you what's possible in the world of sobriety. We introduce you to the various tools, programs, and resources available, because there are way more options than you may even realize. We want you to find the one that works for you.
And we do it through people. People who share their pathway to recovery and will help you find your path to freedom. Because getting sober can feel hard enough. You don't have to do it alone. I'm Sarah Roberts.
And I'm Roger DeVoe, and this is Sobriety Starts Here.
All right. I am so excited to have you here, Laura Silverman. Thank you so much for sitting down with me today.
Hi, Sarah. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. So I want to get right into it. You are the founder of the Sobriety Collective. So can you share with us, what is the Sobriety Collective and who is it for?
Well, the Sobriety Collective started as a little blog, and it's blossomed into what my original vision was, which was to sort of have like a hub for creatives in recovery. And I also wanted a sort of non-12-step model or rhetoric, or I'm not claiming to have for the Sobriety Collective to be a program of any sorts, but I felt when I was first getting sober a little alienated by everything 12-step. And I know that it works for millions of people, but for just as many millions, it doesn't work, it doesn't resonate. And so I wanted to create something that I needed, and I did. And then I found that it resonated with other people. And now we're in a time where there are so many multiple pathways to recovery, and they're all celebrated. And I also knew that there were a lot of other people like you, and like some of our listeners and viewers that are writers, that are photographers, musicians, tattoo artists, chefs, entrepreneurs, fine artists, anything really, anyone who has a creative niche, and who's also in recovery. And so that's kind of, I know it's called the Sobriety Collective, but it's really more of a recovery collective. And I also talk a lot about my lived experience with mental health concerns, namely obsessive compulsive disorder, anxiety, panic, which is why I kind of started drinking, to sort of numb all that and, create a new persona. But I'm kind of jumping ahead.
Okay. And I know that's a big part of a lot of people's story. The reason why they started drinking is because of a lot of these anxiety issues, OCD, mental health issues are pervasive in the sobriety world, in the recovery space. So let's explain, what is the experience when we go to the Sobriety Collective? What is it there?
Well, it's colorful and quirky like me. So ideally, and again, I am coming at this with no sort of user experience design or web design trained background. It's just all trial and error. But when someone goes onto the Sobriety Collective, I want them to feel welcome. I want them to feel like they've got a little nook where they can just sort of connect with other people who are like them. And so it's, when people call it a blog, I'm not going to say, no, it's not a blog, but it's really more than that. I call it a hub. There is a blog, but there's also, a dormant podcast. I haven't recorded in forever. Maybe I should this year. But there's a store, and there's, when I first started out, and a lot of people, I'm not saying it's not about copying, but a lot of people sort of modeled their resource pages after something that I put together called Link Love. It's just a long and by no means comprehensive list. I mean, there's so many more that I haven't added and so many more that will be added, but just lists of podcasts and websites and blogs of people in this space doing their thing. And it started out by me just putting what I liked and what worked for me, sort of like a blog roll, I guess that's what that's called. But more than just that. And then people have sort of reached out to me and wanted to be added to that. And I also have a pretty comprehensive help section for people who are looking to either get or stay sober. And so I have a multitude of programs that they can check out, and for both recovery, addiction recovery, and mental health recovery. A section aimed at teens and young adults, because that's sort of a population that can be underserved. And I was a young adult when I got sober, and I had no idea where to look, and the internet wasn't what it was now. Almost 11 years ago, there was not a lot, and you talk about 16 years ago, so there's like nothing. And then really my pride and joy, the sort of crowning part of the Sobriety Collective, what I want people to go there for, is to really find other people, connect with other people. And it's not like a community in the sense that there's a forum and you can like type back and forth to each other, but it is a community in that people can go on this recovery profile section and connect with those creatives that I was just talking about, read their story. So I have kind of a standard format, so people know what to expect. It's people's names, ages, recovery dates, either from addiction or addictive behaviors, or if they choose to identify as recovering from mental illness, they can put that as their recovery date. And then their creative niche, drug of choice if applicable, then they get their chance to do a recovery story in a nutshell. People have used 2 sentences or they've gone into 2 pages, but I try to keep it concise and short. And then really a section to connect with them on social media, and their own websites. And it's really a platform for them to be able to share what they do. And
it really is amazing. It's an incredible space that you've created. And I love that you talk about the underserved younger generation. And that's so true. But I do love that when you go to the Sobriety Collective, it is bright and beautiful and colorful, and it feels hopeful and optimistic. And it makes you feel like you're part of something bigger than yourself. And I think that's a really important message that both you and I are passionate about sharing, that we are not alone. We are not alone in recovery. We are not weirdos and crazy people and people that just can't figure this shit out. We are people that are struggling in our lives in a way that people that drink normally don't understand. And we need to surround ourselves with people that get it, because there's nothing worse than feeling isolated and other. And I just really respect and applaud you for all of the work that you've been doing with the Sobriety Collective. I think it's an amazing place. I love reading the people's stories. I love that you just posted one not long ago. Oh shoot, I forget his name. You'll tell me. But just, reading these stories is just, it's powerful. It again reminds us that we're not alone, and it's
Paul,
a great
I think
place.
it was Paul Fjord.
Yes, that was exactly it. Paul Fjord.
He was, that hit me.
Yeah, that was a powerful story.
And if I can just say, we still need to do you as a recovery profile, but you were one of the first guest posts that I ever had, and one of the most popular too. So that was back in the day when I was doing guest blog posts, and I need to create more hours in the day.
I find that so often for creatives. You are a creative, and I find that is such a common theme, that we need more than the 24 hours than we're given. But you're doing great work, incredible work, and we're so appreciative of all of what you're doing. So I can't wait for people to be able to log in to Sobriety Collective and check out what's going on, check out those resources, and find out what's happening, because you feel like you don't know where to start, what's going on. That's kind of why we started Sobriety Starts Here. Where do I start with this whole thing? I kind of want to get sober. Yeah. I'm not sure what's going on. Am I alone in this? And these are all.
Do I need to hit a heavy, huge bottom to make changes? And the answer to that, as we both know, is no. You don't. I happen to, and we'll get there. But no one needs to go that low in order to make a change and make healthy changes.
I think that's such a great point, and it's something that we do cover off a lot in these conversations that I've been having, and it's so true. There are people who, I was chatting with Ann Dowsett Johnston, and her bottom was, when it got to 3 glasses of Pinot in the evening, she knew that was crossing a line for her. that to me was just getting started on a Monday, like 3 glasses of wine for me, that was every day. I mean, I don't imagine that I'd ever, I mean, if we're talking 4-ounce or 6-ounce glasses of wine, I mean, yeah, 3 glasses of wine was just the beginning, but that's not to say that everybody doesn't have a place in this. If it doesn't matter, we can raise the bottom. We don't have to lose everything. And then of course I interviewed Melissa Johnston, and I mean, her whole life crumbled in front of her very eyes, and yet she was able to rebuild from there and get to where she is today, helping other people. So like you say, it doesn't matter. We don't have to go to the depths to be able to see what's going on and to change our lives and to realize that these are just not healthy choices for us. So I love that you commented on that. So you've touched on your story a little bit. I want to just get right into it. I want you to share your story, starting from when you were a child and working your way up all the way to the point where you found recovery and then into what you're doing today. So I'm going to pass the microphone to you, Laura.
Okay. Please feel free to prompt me along, because I need horse blinders sometimes. I can just be woo, like, okay. So starting from childhood. All right. So I grew up in a loving family. My father was a U.S. diplomat, so I traveled abroad. I lived in the United States only 4 out of 18 years of my formative upbringing. Nicaragua, Peru, El Salvador, and Egypt. I was actually born in Cairo, and we returned when I was starting high school, and I did all 4 years of high school in Egypt. I always felt, and this is not a reflection on my family, but it's just a reflection on me, and also I found a lot of other people who have found recovery, they felt something sort of missing. And when I was in the program, so to speak, people refer to it as like a God-shaped or a God-sized hole or something, where there's just like this something that feels missing, and for me that sort of took the shape of feeling like an outcast, and I think that had to do with sort of what was going on in the inside, but also a product of moving around a lot and having to make friends again. And as a child, that was very difficult. I've always been sensitive to this day, more than just empathetic, but just I feel very strongly. And I was always a very feeling sensitive kid. And people could pick up on that. And even just my peers in elementary school and middle school, they picked up on the fact that I took things very personally and seriously, and I was bullied a lot for basically, I mean, luckily I wasn't physically assaulted, but I was verbally attacked, and I don't want to make light of it, because it scarred me for a while, for a long time. So I was pretty much all of elementary school, and then middle school is hard for anyone. It really is. But I was a new kid in a new school in a new country, and I found friends. They were mostly sort of the other outcasts, nerds and geeks. They're all doing well now, but that's what happens with nerds and geeks. We flourish in adulthood. But I was, and even they mocked me and bullied me and teased me. So I was kind of going into the teenage years as someone who had no self-esteem. I felt very worthless and not worthy of a lot. And I'll tell you, I'm going on 35 this year, and I still struggle with feelings of worth. And that's just a part of growing up. But I also think that the fact that I didn't have the best childhood in the sense of relating to my peers, not because of my family, but because of my peers.
Can I ask, did you share this with your family when you were going through these struggles as a kid, or did you keep it inside? You did?
I shared with them, and from time to time my mom would get involved, and if there was a particular person that was like really making my life miserable, then we would talk to like the counselor, and then they would bring the kid in, and of course they would play nice in the counseling meeting and then make my life even worse afterwards. So I think we learned that was not the best way to go about doing things, and that I could just come to my family when I was struggling, but I needed to, it wasn't a matter of toughening up or anything. Anyway, it was shitty, sucked. And high school got better, but it was still difficult. And so anyway, all throughout this, I've had anxiety, more than just sort of like the, first day of school jitters. It was more like this just kind of low level, pervasive feeling of like minor panic, maybe, which I didn't really. So, okay, I haven't talked about my childhood in a little bit.
No, and I'm really glad, and I want you to stay there. So I want you to kind of get into that, if you don't mind. I know that a lot of people are relating to your story, so keep going.
Well, okay, so I didn't feel like a ton of panic daily, but it was obviously exacerbated whenever, these bullies would make my life miserable. But what really, really sort of was the driving point for what happened next was my brother is a year and a half older than me, and he was only a year ahead of me in school. And he and most of my close friends were all seniors when I was a junior. And that was my junior year, was really the best year of my high school days. When they went to college, and it wasn't just, for a lot of people who have older siblings who go to college, they can visit them, on Christmas break, or maybe more often than I was able to see my brother and my friends, because I was living in Egypt and they were all the way, in the United States. And so I didn't have any friends really anymore. I knew who the kids were at school, but I didn't have friends. And what happened was that I got into a pretty depressive state, and it's what anyone would diagnose as clinical depression. But I didn't have a therapist at the time. My symptoms were almost daily panic attacks. I skipped, now this is from, I was one of, okay, let me back up a little bit. I wasn't the smartest kid in the class, but I was definitely one of the kids who got honors, every report card, or high honors. So I was a good student, and I was always attending class. And what happened my senior year was that I was starting to skip a lot, because being in the classroom was giving me an anxiety attack. I would skip assemblies. I wouldn't go on field trips. I wouldn't go on, I didn't hang out with anyone really. And I would cry a lot. And it was just miserable, miserable, miserable. And you know what? I didn't even consider like starting to drink or use anything. I was just so in my head about it. I should mention that my first experience with alcohol was the summer before senior year. So I was an intern at the American Embassy in Egypt, and all these cool kids from school who had graduated and come back to be interns while they were in college, they were going out, and so in Egypt, you're pretty close to the Nile River. And so what a lot of the kids did, we would go down these Nile River boats called feluccas, and they would all bring beer, and we would just kind of drink and get tipsy on a boat down the Nile. It's kind of an interesting pastime.
Not a lot of people can say that they have had that experience. I will say that.
Right, that's true. So I think I might have had 2 beers, and I was like 3 sheets to the wind, but I felt alive. And it's just so cliched, like hearing myself say it, but I felt that feeling of like, this is what it feels like to belong. This is what it feels like to be. I wasn't dorky anymore. I felt popular. Of course, this is what I was feeling. I'm sure I didn't look, drunk even off of just a couple of beers, but that feeling was like, ooh, I like this. I like feeling like this. And of course, my mom ahead of time, she was like, I know that the kids drink on these boats. I need you not to drink. And of course I drank. Oops. Sorry. And I came home drunk, and not my proudest moment, but I sort of had a taste for what would come later. And so that happened, but then my senior year happened, which was the complete opposite of that feeling of belonging. And it was miserable. I I never want to go back to that place. And I've had minor bouts of depression since, but that was, I think, the worst that my life ever got, to be honest.
So you tried drinking that summer, and then you didn't drink again, and then senior year was really hard for you. That was when you
really
really
hard for me, but I didn't mess around with drinking then. I didn't really have friends. It was just awful. And I never I live in an apartment building, and I'm just going to say some sensitive things, and I can hear doors open. So I never got suicidal. I never had those thoughts, but I didn't see myself graduating from high school. I didn't know how I was going to magically get whisked away into college. That period of my life felt so bleak that I didn't know how I was going to ever change. It just felt so, I'm feeling the anxiety, just kind of going back and revisiting it. So, and another way that my anxiety sort of manifested itself was, for whatever reason, I formed a very overactive bladder. Way young, 17, I was having these feelings that maybe a 75-year-old might have, where I was constantly having to go, and then what was psychological, what was physiological, and I would skip classes because I was afraid of having an accident, which I haven't had, by the way, since I was 4 or 5. But it was just this constant feeling of, oh shoot, my internet connection. Can you still hear me?
Yep. No, you're
okay.
Good.
Just this constant feeling of do I have to go? Oh, now that I do, and when anyone really is feeling anxious or nervous, it's a natural reaction of the body to have the bladder contract and you have to go. Well, that was just sort of my day, every day. And it was awful. Somehow I graduated. I went to college. I was, and before I really get into the story of drinking, I will say that I was so relieved when all of my other girlfriends had to go to the bathroom too. Oh, that's a side effect of drinking. Now I didn't feel so other because of my and I'll be honest with you, it wasn't all physio. I mean, it really wasn't mostly physiological. A lot of it was psychological. Also, fun fact, a lot of that has continued to this day, not in terms of the feeling, but in terms of I'm just always mentally aware of where's the bathroom? Okay. And it's just something that I will continue to manage in my life, but it's just sort of the awareness of when moms tell their kids to go to the bathroom before a road trip, I'm kind of go to the bathroom before anything. But anyway, so here I am in college. It was really hard to say goodbye to my parents because I'm very close to my family. And they were moving to El Salvador while I was in Virginia in university. But here I was, I got to reinvent myself. I know it sounds so cliched when you hear it, but it's true. They didn't know that I was, an other in school. And that's maybe putting it a little bit bleakly, but I was definitely trying to shed that old identity of the nerd and by the way, nerds rock. They're so cool. But at the time, I didn't feel that way. And of course, I didn't set out to be a binge drinker. I didn't set out to be a party animal, but I wanted to feel popular, which I never really had that experience of growing up. And then I also wanted to minimize those feelings of anxiety and the OCD that I had. And so I found that with drinking, at least on the weekend, because I didn't start drinking during the week until after college. But, I just drank on the weekends with my friends. We would go out to frat parties and
do what we do at frat parties.
What we do at a frat party, which is embarrassing. But I started with maybe a couple of beers, and that would get me tipsy. And by the end of college, I mean, multiple bottles of wine, shots of Everclear. Your tolerance does go up, and as more and more you drink, and it had definitely gone up. So anyway, college wasn't all a blur, but a lot of it was. And as has been said before, and I've said it, and then Anna David has this sort of feature where she calls it like first fun, then problems, or something like that. But first it was fun, and it was fun with problems, and it was just problems. And that was kind of the trajectory of things for me. The fun lasted not, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to ask. So when you have mentioned a couple of times that you suffered with obsessive compulsive disorder, was this diagnosed, or was this just something that you felt in your life that you were obsessing over things?
The obsessing and compulsions. Most of my compulsions throughout my life have been mental. In that, I mean, it's all mental, but like the way that the things that I sort of do over and over, or no one can really see them. They're all mental, but there are some things that I do continue to this day. Like I'm constantly checking the stove, more than a regular person, or a regular, more than a non-OCD person might have, or might do. And even though I know that I've turned off the faucet, I see myself turning off the faucet. Sometimes I have to like look at myself with like a Buddhist awareness. Like I'm watching myself turn this faucet off, and yet I still have to like press it shut a couple times to feel right. So no, it was never diagnosed as I was growing up, because I really thought that I was the only, and because a lot of it was mental, in that no one could really see the things that I was doing. So a lot of parents nowadays can see if their kids have OCD, because they're visibly doing they're visibly
they're displaying the behavior,
acting out their compulsions.
Right.
But I was not diagnosed. And then when I was in college, I took a Psych 101 class. We were learning about all these mental disorders, and I read about OCD, and I was floored. I was floored because I realized I wasn't the only person in the world that had this, but it was a complete, I mean, I was a textbook case, and it felt comforting to know that I wasn't alone, and also scary to know that I had something that was diagnosable. I mean, that like it was a thing. So it only got like officially diagnosed as an adult, but I knew that I knew something was different. It's still something I struggle with, and in terms of like the compulsions, but also the obsessions. I'm not just a worrier, because I do worry a lot, but I'm like a catastrophizer, and then I start to worry about things like that I have no control over, and I get into a really deep place sometimes.
Well, I'd like maybe as we progress with your story, maybe you can share how you manage those obsessive thoughts so that it can help other people who might be dealing with the same thing. But let's keep going on this train. So yes, you are now so you graduate college.
Yes, I do. Yay. Meanwhile, I mean, I did have a lot of like embarrassing, borderline, like very unhealthy relationships with alcohol and what I was doing to my body. But I didn't really recognize it, because I happened to hang out with a lot of other people who were doing similar things. And maybe their consequence, I couldn't really see their consequences all the time because I wasn't them. But it seemed that I wasn't completely out of the ordinary in terms of what I was doing. But I was starting to get like a feel for, why are these things happening to me and not necessarily always to my friends? And I graduated. And ironically, or strangely enough, my last semester of college, I got Dean's List, which I hadn't gotten my whole college career. I went to a very rigorous university that is known for working hard, and at the time known for playing hard, the University of Virginia. The culture has changed since, but at the time people partied hard and they worked hard. So I graduated and I moved up to the DC area. I've been in the DC area since, but I've moved around between Virginia and Maryland. So
So you graduate college.
Thank you. Keep me on track.
And then so you get a job, I'm assuming.
I got a job. I didn't get a job right away because well, I didn't have enough time from my last semester of college to finding a job, and I didn't have anywhere to live in the States because my parents were still abroad. So I moved back to El Salvador for a couple of months, and I worked at the embassy as an intern. And then I looked for jobs from El Salvador in the DC area, and somehow I lined up some interviews. And so my dad paid for a trip, and I was going to stay somewhere between 2 weeks and a month in DC, and I would stay with my brother. And what ended up happening was that I took the first job that I was offered. I interviewed a lot, and I only got offered one job, and I realized it wasn't my dream by any stretch of the imagination. But if I didn't take it, I would have to go back to El Salvador, and I didn't know when I would be able to find a job again. So I took it, and I moved, and I just stayed. And so my parents sent some boxes up, and I moved in with my best friend who had a house in the area. And so I sort of got my start as a young professional, 22. And now at the time, most of my friends were still drinking, and a lot of them still pretty heavily. So I kind of just continued the pattern that I had in college, which was just a weekend binge drinker. So I didn't feel like I was any sort of problem drinker or alcoholic because I was keeping it together during the week. And I wasn't missing work. I wasn't missing commitments. At that point, I wasn't. But as this disease does progress, I started to drink wine during the week. Sometimes it was just a glass, but I had a big glass, and I could find that I could pour pretty much a whole bottle in there and call it a glass of wine. And I started doing things like hiding my empty bottles in a garbage bag in my room because I didn't want my housemates to see how much I was drinking.
And so were you drinking alone when you were drinking the wine, or were you going out with people during the week?
The wine was a solo thing, but I was a social drinker and a solo drinker.
Yeah.
And that was the pattern that continued until I stopped drinking. I never went from just social to solo. I did both. But what happened in 2 short years after college graduation was that I found that my drinking picked up and my friends toned their habits down for the most part. They were still going out, but they weren't like getting crazy. They had work in the morning, or they're like, oh, I don't want to spend all of Sunday hungover. Like, let's just kind of, they could stop at that tipsy feeling, which is what I always really strived for. But I couldn't stay there. I just didn't know when to stop. I didn't know how to stick to limits that I did try to self-impose. So I would do all the things that we do, stick to a limit, which didn't work. Only drink a certain type of alcohol, which didn't work because you get to a certain point of being drunk, and then like all things kind of go out the window. Yep. And then you get wasted, and then it gets ugly.
Yeah.
And so 2 things happened after college graduation that were sort of pivotal to my path. I was hospitalized twice for alcohol poisoning. I feel lucky that I didn't have my stomach pumped, although I wouldn't have known because I was just out. But I'm told that it was the 2 times I was hospitalized were mostly for monitoring to make sure that I wouldn't go into any more serious state, and also because there was at the time no safe place for me to be, because I had just gotten so drunk that, I mean, anything I said was incomprehensible to anyone. So let me go to the first time, and then I'll address the second time. The first time was in October of 2005.
How old were you then?
I was 22,
Mm-hmm.
22 and a half. So I graduated from college in May of 2005, and this was just that fall. And it was sort of like a homecoming because I was going back to Charlottesville for a concert. And ironically, both hospitalizations happened around concerts. But so I was going to see Jason Mraz, who at the time was like I traveled around the country to see him, and I loved him so much. Of course, I don't remember really anything from that concert, but what had happened was I went down to Charlottesville from DC with who at the time was my best friend from college. She was my drinking buddy, and we had a very toxic codependent relationship, very unhealthy. And so we traveled down together, and we didn't really eat much during the day. And then, no, she never made me drink. I'm the one who drank. So I never blamed her for that, but things did happen when I was around her that weren't necessarily happening around other friends. And so I think, and I do hope that she's okay now, but I had to cut ties with her when I got sober, and we'll get to that later, and tips that I have for anyone who's brand new. But what had happened, my understanding anyway, is what I've been told, is that I got so drunk. I mean, we pre-gamed a lot, and then we drank during the concert, and then because at the time we were of legal age, and then afterward we went to a bar and got worse. And for the first time in my life, I was kicked out of a bar. And it was like one of those hardcore, like, people go there to drink. And yet I was the one kicked out. I was never someone who was kicked out of a bar. And apparently bystanders found me passed out. I'm pretty sure I blacked out too, because I don't remember much, or maybe it was browning out. But they found me passed out outside of this bar, and an ambulance was called, and I was taken to the University of Virginia Medical Center. And I don't remember much, but I do remember seeing some of my friends there in the morning, or whenever it was that I kind of woke up or came to. I don't remember much, but I do remember that it scared me so much. And I was staying with so I think I was supposed to stay with this particular friend, but I was just so upset that I called a younger friend of mine from college who was a nursing student, and she had an apartment, and I just crashed there. Called my best friend in the whole world, who I've known since I was 14. We met in Egypt, and she also went to UVA, and she was the one who I moved in with after college graduation. And I called her, and I told her I told her what happened, or at least what I was told what happened, and she put everything that she was doing down, and she drove to Charlottesville and picked me up.
Wow, that is a good friend.
She had Gatorade with her, and she didn't ask any questions, and she didn't judge me, and she just took me home. And we've been friends for 20 years now. I haven't seen her in a little bit. She's a mom of two, but she's my sister, and she stuck with me through some pretty ugly times. And I have so much gratitude for people like her, who have stood by me, and when they've seen me at my worst. I've made a ton of friends in recovery who see me as the version of myself that I am now. And I've always been me, but I definitely feel like I'm a better, healthier version of myself now. But she stuck by me when I was really low and icky, and so I'm so grateful for her. She picked me up and took me back home, and that experience scared me off drinking for a little bit. I didn't make any sort of conscious choice that I was going to quit, and I certainly didn't think of myself as an alcoholic, because at least in all media portrayals that I had seen. I wasn't living under a bridge. I wasn't homeless. I wasn't drinking out of a paper bag, and I was still going to work. But wait, I had just gotten hospitalized. So I realized that there were elements of a problem, but I didn't really know what to do with that. And so what I did was just, I stopped for a while, and I didn't make a conscious choice. I'm going to stop for a few months, or I just kind of let my body and mind have a break. But because I didn't have any sort of plan of getting healthy or seeing any sort of mental health professional, which I should have done a long time ago, what happened was that I, over time, kind of picked up where I left off. I had this quarterly shipment of wine that I received from this winery. So I was getting my wine. I was also able to, drive to the store and get more if I need. Now I never drove drunk, which I'm very grateful for, because who knows what could have happened. But
so do you remember when it was that because you said that you sort of non-consciously just decided to stop after that first hospitalization? Do you remember when it was that you made the decision to all of a sudden get wine delivered to your house or go to the store and buy wine? Do you remember that day where you're like, I'm going to drink again?
No. Well, see, I was still getting the wine shipments. I had gotten them before the hospitalization. I just didn't cancel them. I didn't think I needed to. And I did sort of, now we're going back, I don't know, 13 years. I can't remember. I really can't, but I do know that some of the behavior has continued, in the sense that, so I was getting these ambulance bills and emergency room bills from my time in the hospital that I was just letting go to collections, because I was in such a deep denial that something happened and that I needed to pay for it. Isn't that what health insurance is for? So I don't remember at what point I got back into drinking, because I didn't really have this self-imposed time limit. I just knew that I needed to cut back. And so whether I cut back or completely abstained for a while, I don't even remember. But I do remember that it didn't take long before I picked up on the old habits that I had. And I should say that there were plenty of nights where I was able to drink like a normal person would. I would go out to restaurants with friends and have a glass or two of wine, or if we were going to a Mexican restaurant, a margarita, that's it, one, which was rare. But there were times that I was able to drink completely normally, and I didn't drink daily. I was never a daily drinker. And so I figured if I wasn't a daily drinker and I didn't drink to the point of excess every time, I didn't have a problem. And so those were sort of the rationalizations that I had during that period of time. Plus I had a job and I was getting there, and, all the things that were sort of hallmarks of making it, I wasn't making much of anything, but, so I didn't recognize anything as a problem then. But my first hospitalization was definitely a wake-up call. It was very frightening, very scary. And because my family was still living abroad, my parents, they didn't see the extent of everything. And so they didn't even know about this. But there were times since that hospitalization and before my second hospitalization that they had to get involved in things, because there'd be times where I blacked out and came to without, belongings or whatever. And somehow I'd have to find my way home. And so I feel icky just thinking about it. But, like a taxi driver this is way before Uber. I didn't have a smartphone to get an Uber anyway, but I remember vaguely a taxi driver sort of taking pity on me and giving me a ride home, sort of in exchange for some things. And that felt really gross, but I didn't know what else to do. So things like that were starting to happen. And one time
you're saying sexual favors in return for getting driven home.
Yes, and I don't really remember the extent of them. I don't think they were, it was just a gross and icky time, and I'd rather move past that if that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Absolutely. You can move
So,
past anything you like, but I really
right.
appreciate you sharing, because I know that so many people have done things, myself included, where we just sit here and go, I can't believe that that was me. It's almost like you're occupied by somebody else in your body and making
Yeah.
decisions that you would never, ever, ever make if
Yeah,
you
I
are in
just,
your right mind. Yeah.
exactly. It just
Yeah.
didn't feel like
Yeah.
me. And I don't
Yeah.
remember I don't remember what actually happened and what I'm thinking happened, but I do know that there were times like that where things that I would never have said yes to
Yeah.
happened. And
Definitely.
um
So move us to the
so
second
moving forward.
time that you had been hospitalized for alcohol poisoning. What happened there?
So it was also around a concert. So October 2005 was the first time. July 2007 was the second time. So there had been some time in between where I did sort of get back to those old habits. Um, and and so this band called Dispatch, which was very popular when I was in college. They're still around today. They're an indie band, sort of like a mixture of a jam. It doesn't really matter what they are, but they were immensely popular, and I was obsessed with them. And so one of my coworkers was equally as obsessed, and we decided we would take a bus up to New York City and go see the concert at Madison Square Garden. And my cousin, one of my cousins, was living in the city at the time, and so the plan was for me to stay at her place after the concert. It was sorry. The plan was pretty loose in the way that it came together, and so even if things had gone as planned, I'm not sure how it would have all happened. But in theory, we were going to see the concert, and I was going to take a taxi to her apartment after. What happened wasn't that. So the very nutshell version, because it's a long story, but we drank on the bus on the way up, little airplane bottles from the ABC store. And then when we got there, I didn't, I didn't know what I was in for, but this coworker of mine was into some harder drugs. And meanwhile, I'm thinking he's the one who's going to sort of watch over me and like be responsible for me, because heaven forbid I be accountable for myself and be responsible for myself. But this, and I still feel kind of naive and sheltered for saying this, but this was my first experience like being in front of cocaine, and I had not even seen it in all of my craziness in college. So that was my first hint that maybe I wasn't going to be like taken care of and watched over. And so that was me like in my tipsy mind, like maybe I should, watch out for myself. But you get sort of past a certain threshold and everything goes out the window. And so I was drinking at his friend's apartment, and then we went to a restaurant to have like an appetizer, more drinks. The appetizer was the only thing I ate all day, which was not healthy. And maybe this resonates with some people, but I had some disordered eating around drinking because I wanted to often save calories for alcohol, and or I knew that, when it got really bad, I realized that like the less food I had, the more drunk I would get. That being said, I did intend on eating that day because I wanted to sort of sustain myself, and I knew I could still get drunk off of a full stomach. It would just take more. So it wasn't my intention to not eat very much, but that's what happened. And I continued drinking at the concert too. And then something happened where I didn't completely black out, but at a certain point I browned out, and I only remember little bits and pieces for the rest of the night. And what happened, my first sort of memory is of seeing like a security guard or an attendant from the venue with a flashlight, and asked to remove myself from this kind gentleman's lap. Somehow I landed there. And then honestly, the next thing I remember is running around in the lobby of the venue. And for anyone who doesn't know, Madison Square Garden is like the biggest concert venue / where the basketball team plays. I mean, it's huge.
Mm-hmm.
It's huge, and it's easy to get lost there, even if you have your full wits about you. I had zero wits about me, and I had been separated from my supposed friends and my belongings, my purse. I guess I just abandoned my purse, and somehow a shoe as well. And I was just running around the lobby, like scared and confused. I think when that security guard asked me to like remove myself, I might have just run away. I don't even know how I got there. But my next memory is being in the lobby, and then the next memory after that is approaching just anyone, like a bystander, and asking them to use their phone so that I could, locate my phone. But nothing came out in English.
Mm-hmm.
It was just drunk babble.
Mm-hmm.
Somehow we had called my number, and it just it went to voicemail. So here I am crying hysterically and not speaking in any language that anyone could recognize, and clearly distraught. And I feel fortunate and also slightly, when I think about it, so many awful things could have happened because it's just in the heart of New York City. And it's such a busy, busy place, and anything could have happened. But the fortunate thing about being in front of that venue is that there were a lot of police officers there, and they saw that I was not well enough to, they couldn't even communicate with me, so they called an ambulance, and I was taken to a hospital in New York City. The only thing I remember before coming to later is that, I was crying and being picked up by this EMT, and I was like, "Where are you taking me?" And he says, "The hospital," and then I passed out. So there was a combination of browning out and passing out that night. So I came to, or woke up, whatever you want to call it, probably like 7 hours later, 6 or 7 hours later, completely confused as to where I was, what had happened, where my things were, what had just happened.
And you're in the hospital.
I'm in the hospital. Hospitals are scary enough for anyone. They're just confusing and sterile and clinical. And I didn't know, I'd never been to New York City before. Here I was visiting one of their hospitals. Like, why not? Sometimes you have to joke about these things because it's what it is. But here I was, and I had no idea how to get in touch with anyone that I knew or loved, because this was cell phone era, and my parents had just moved back to the country. I didn't know their phone number, and I didn't know my cousin's phone number off the top of my head. And so, the only number I knew by heart was the only number that hadn't changed in my entire childhood, and that was of my grandmother in Chicago. And she was the same grandma of my cousin. And so I called her, and I was still a little drunk, but even then I felt guilty for lying to her, but I had no other choice. And so she gave me my cousin's number, and, she was sort of my guardian angel there. I should say that meanwhile, I'm passed out in this hospital bed. There's a phone tree going on in my family. They're wondering where I am. Why have I not arrived at Melanie, my cousin? I don't want to give her identity away, but my cousin's apartment. No one had heard from me, and for a few hours, around 3, I'm told by my family, and this was really difficult to hear, but it was necessary in terms of me, coming to terms with the harm that I had caused them, and myself, of course. But I'm told that around 3 a.m, they received a call from a security guard at Madison Square Garden. Someone had found my purse or turned my purse in, and I still had battery left in my phone, and so they were calling some recent numbers. And they called my mother and basically said, it appears that we have your daughter's belongings. We don't know where she is. We just thought you should know, kind of, that we're trying to track her down. Have you heard from her, kind of thing? And then of course they hadn't. And this whole phone tree ensues at like 3 or 4 in the morning with my family. And, my brother and my parents and my cousins and everyone was involved, and no one had heard from me. And so there was like this basically 7 or 8 hour period of time where I was unaccounted for. And that like, it really like hit home and resonated with me. And I knew that I was hurting myself. I knew that this wasn't healthy. But when I realized how much I had like hurt my family, something inside of me, I don't know how to explain it, but it just shifted, it clicked. And I really want, my purse was still intact. We went to the venue the following day to pick it up, and everything was in there, including my bus ticket back home. And so, I wanted to just stay at my cousin's apartment and not leave until it was time for me to go back to DC, but she wouldn't leave me alone. So she's like, we're going out to dinner with my friends. I'm not leaving you. And so I say this because at dinner that night, after several panic attacks, she's like, look, I'm not going to tell your parents. I'm not your parents. You can drink tonight, but just don't fuck up again, kind of that. And I said this, and I know that people recognize that there have been so many times where we've said, I'm never drinking again. I'm never doing that again, because I had so many I nevers over the course of time. But I said, I don't want to drink. I don't think I ever want to drink again. I meant it. I think. I say I think because when I did come back and I sought help for myself, I didn't necessarily think I was quitting forever. That sounded really scary and looming. But I knew that I needed to make some serious changes, and it ended up being whatever forever is, because it's been a long time.
Wow. So that night when you said to her, I don't think I ever want to drink again, that's your sobriety date?
Yeah, that was July 14th, 2007. And so the concert was the 13th. Maybe I had a little something to drink the morning of the 14th, but that day, the day after the concert is when I consider my sobriety date to be. And, I got home to DC in one piece, and I called one of my coworkers who was not my boss, but sort of like sort of a supervisory type relationship. And I told her I needed to take some time off work because something terrible happened and I couldn't concentrate. And so I took a few days off of work, and I called the number on the back of my health insurance card for substance abuse and mental health services. I knew enough about what had happened. I mean, I wasn't stupid. I was in denial, but I wasn't stupid. Mm-hmm. I knew enough about what had happened that that's the number I needed to call. Mm. And they had me come in later that day for an intake for like a questionnaire, just to see if I'd be appropriate for their programs. Now, at the time, I couldn't afford, both time-wise and financially, to go to a 28-day rehab, even though I'm sure I could have benefited from that, but I just didn't have the time or the money. What I did have time and money for was an intensive outpatient program that was put on by my health insurance provider. And so I talked to my boss. I did not tell him what had happened because I wasn't ready yet, but I told him, and he could sort of read through the lines, but I told him there were some family issues and I needed to go to family counseling for X amount of time, for X amount of weeks, whatever. And he's like, okay, I will support you just as long as you stay with the company, and, sort of like a mutual relationship where, he would support me and I'd support him in turn.
So I'd love you to help us understand, because a lot of people don't know what outpatient treatment is like. Yeah. I've interviewed some people that have done inpatient treatment, and we know that what that feels like. You have a bed, you get up every morning. It's a very routine thing. What is it like to be in outpatient treatment?
Well, outpatient treatment's the only experience that I have it's the only thing I know how to describe. And what my program was 5 weeks, 3 times a week for 2 hours each, 2-hour sessions. So you're looking at 6 hours a week for 5 weeks. Basic math, 30 hours total, right?
Yep.
Coupled with 15 hours of Alcoholics Anonymous. So we had to go to 15 meetings. Now I guess it was only 30 hours, but it felt like a lot longer.
And what did you do in that time? What was the experience like?
So what would happen is that the first hour we would get breathalyzed every time. Oftentimes there were people who came and blew something, or maybe they didn't blow anything from that day, but they had something to drink a couple of days before, even though they were in this program. So I should say a lot of people who were in my sort of cohort of treatment were not there by choice. They were there because their family forced them into it. Their employer gave them one last chance through their EAP, or courts mandated treatment. And this was what was the viable option for them. So I was in sort of with a motley crew of people. I was one of the only people, if not the only person, who was there out of their own volition. And I think that did make a difference for me, because I wanted to be there. I was scared, and I didn't know what I was in for, and I didn't know how much if I was going to stop forever or just for a few months or a year, but I wanted to change and I needed help. So what happened is that first hour we would get breathalyzed, and then have like a sharing circle. We would check in with our name and what we considered our sobriety date. So everyone's stayed the same for a while, but as time went on in this 5-week period, people started to change, because they're like, well, I went to a barbecue over the weekend, I couldn't say no to beer, or whatever happened, and mine kept staying the same. And so we would go around, share our sobriety dates, and then, or at least the last day we drank or used, and then we would sort of have a sharing circle, like check in with each other, see what was going on, how the past day was, because it was usually only a course of a day since we had seen each other last. And then that second hour would be sort of psychoeducation, which I didn't know that term at the time, but we would watch a documentary or read an article and talk about it. We did watch a couple of episodes of Intervention, and it would just sort of be an opportunity to learn more about addiction or addictive behaviors and the consequences that they have on individuals and on families. And so we also, as I mentioned, had to go to 15 separate meetings of AA. So it wasn't a 12-step rehab program per se, but it sort of had a 12-step facilitation model, in that AA was encouraged for after completion of the rehab program, and we weren't exposed to anything like smart recovery, or I don't think refuge recovery existed back then, but we definitely weren't told to go online, like see what's out there, see all the blogs, and because there really wasn't much then, but it was just, it was just AA.
So can you share, do you know, what do you think was the difference between what you were doing versus the people that were in your cohort that were changing their sobriety date because they couldn't sort of pass it up at the barbecue or whatever the case may be? What do you think you were doing differently?
I think vague recollection, because we're going back in time here, but I think some of the things that I was doing almost immediately out the gate from deciding that I needed help and signed up for this program was, well, first of all, I removed all alcohol from my house, at least my own alcohol. So
you canceled the wine subscription.
As a matter of fact, I canceled the wine subscription, and I gave my parents the last box, which had a white, a red, a rosé, and a seasonal. Very important. Yeah. I immediately kind of isolated myself socially. which at the time in the very, very beginning, I needed to just not go out. And I had, my best friend who I mentioned before, I was living with her and she knew what was going on. She was completely supportive. And even though she didn't have the same issues that I did and never had a drinking problem, she was very sensitive to what I was going through and didn't drink around me. I also cut some ties, namely with that, what I interpreted to be a toxic codependent relationship. And part of this whole going into rehab, even if it's in an outpatient capacity process, was also seeing a mental health professional. And I saw a psychiatrist who diagnosed me with OCD, with anxiety, with panic disorder. And I started an antidepressant, not for depression. My depression was senior year of high school, but for the anxiety and OCD. And then I started seeing a counselor separately for therapy. So
you really started adding tools into the toolbox. I'm wondering,
not knowing what I was doing, but yes, I did. And then I was also reading a lot of self-help books back then. And I read a memoir while I was in this rehab that completely changed things. And I would love to mention it, if that's okay.
Please.
It's called Smashed, Story of a Drunken Girlhood by Corinne Zalkaz. Very unusual name, but reading that book changed me. And I need to reread it because I don't remember a lot of what happened, but it felt like I was reading my story, minus a couple of stomach pumpings. And the author didn't really resonate with 12 steps either. And that kind of, I was going to these meetings as prescribed and getting my papers signed. No one wants to do that. And so I realized that in hindsight, I'm lost in my thought right now. What I was going to say is that, no one in the very beginning wants to go to AA, and certainly, well, maybe they do, but no one wants to get their papers signed and sort of walk with their tail between their legs up to the meeting facilitator and have someone sign it. You feel like you're a delinquent, like you're, in detention. And so, but I did continue going to meetings after I, completed this program because it was a support that was there. And it is what I knew at the time. And I needed to be around other people who sort of got what I was going through. But all the while, I never really felt like it stuck. I didn't work the steps in my first time in AA. And I did go back a couple of years later. If you want me to touch on that now, we might be running low on time. I don't know, but I did go back to AA at around the 3-year mark, and I stayed for 18 months. And I really got into things. I found a sober support network. I worked with a sponsor who I've since connected with, and she was also at She Recovers in New York City, which was crazy.
Wow.
And it was really amazing to reconnect with her. Actually, we reconnected over the home group. But I found a sponsor. I worked the steps. I made amends with my family and the friends who, were willing to hear from me. And, I continued with therapy, and I got service positions. I went on AA retreats. I went to all these like sober socials and things. And I really found what I needed at the time. And then I found that, AA had given me quite a lot, and I continue to credit it to this day. There are extreme like polar opposites. There are the lovers, and then there are the haters, but there's not a lot of us who are sort of like in the middle, who respect what the program does, but don't necessarily use it anymore. And it gave me elements of a life, but when it was starting to become my life, I had to take a step back. And my parents noticed this too. They're like, "We were so proud of the progress that you've made. But all you do is AA now and hang out with AA people. And might you want to look at that?" And I was like, you're right. That's all I'm doing. And so over time, I tapered my meeting attendance back and continued all of the sort of toolbox tools of recovery that I had, not calling it that at the time. And then I realized I don't need to go to meetings. I go to a meeting because I want to go, but I don't need to go. And I got tired of hearing the same kind of thing, and it was all very similar white Christian male rhetoric, and it just
I think it's really important, and I'm really glad that you brought this up, because I think it's really important to highlight the value that people get from AA. It is an incredible program. So many people out there have benefited from it. There are pieces of it that I have used in my own life, including, you know, that idea at the beginning of one day at a time. But it doesn't mean that anything has to be forever. And I feel that that's sometimes the way that we want to approach things in sobriety, or in when we are fully immersed in recovery, where we think that we have to keep going back to honor that, and we have to continue to go back to that. And it's just not simply the case. The case is that sometimes there are things, just like relationships, that serve us for a time, and then when we are finished with that, and you know, we can still take from it and use from it, but we can move on into other things. So I think it's a really important part of your story to honor that, and to say that AA really helped you in the beginning. It was something that you used as a tool. You valued it, you got a lot from it, but there were other things that you wanted to explore in your life and in your recovery as well. So I think it's important to honor that. I also wanted to touch back on, way early in our conversation today, you mentioned that you wanted to express how to cut ties with somebody who is feeling where you are feeling like it's a toxic or codependent relationship. And you just mentioned doing that. So I want to hear from you. How do you go about doing that? Because I know a lot of us in early sobriety, especially, we don't know how to do it. So tell us what you did.
Especially since a lot of us are people pleasers.
Yeah.
I am a huge people pleaser, and I don't want people to not like me. What I did, I think I just kind of made a cold, hard cut. And I said, I don't even know if I gave an explanation that I couldn't see her anymore. I just knew that I needed, for my sobriety and my sanity, to not be with toxic people. Now, that's not to say that I didn't find other toxic people in sobriety that I spent time with and then cut ties with, and then, and not because I sought them out, but just because they happened to come about. And I think the biggest thing that anyone has to do when they're really serious about sobriety as a journey and as a health decision is that it's a physical health decision, it's a spiritual health decision, it's a mental health decision. And part of that spiritual and mental health is making sure that you are happy, not all the time, but like you have elements of happiness and contentment and peace and serenity. And toxic people are not going to provide that. And they're just going to take you down their rabbit hole. And if you know your past behaviors as being toxic, then it's very easy to get sucked back into those cycles. So I think the biggest thing you have to do is just have no apologies and just do it. It's not easy, but, and I don't even know how I did it, but I just stopped accepting invitations. And maybe she thinks I'm a bitch, and maybe she thought I was a bitch then, and she badmouths me to this day, and maybe it wasn't all her fault, and a lot of it was my fault. I take a lot of responsibility for what I did. I'm not proud of everything that I did. But I also know that it's not black and white with me. It's probably not black and white with my former toxic friends either. They're people, and they have their own problems and their own triumphs too. But spending time together wasn't good for either of us. And because I am living in my body and my mind and my heart, I had to do what's best for me.
Yeah, I totally appreciate that. And I think that they would probably also look at the reality and see a totally different perception of it, right? Because we all filter it through our own lens.
Oh, like, yeah, absolutely. I'm sure she was like, oh, she was a bitch, whatever. I don't need her, but whatever, because I needed, and, you know, and in sobriety, I reconnected with her and gave her a chance and said, you know, let's spend some time with each other and see if we still have, you know, elements of a friendship to sort of salvage. And she was pretty receptive to it, but she just kind of went back to her old habits. And I was like, I can't do this. And then another friend who I had been drinking buddies with seemed to be quite supportive of my sobriety journey. But whenever we hung out together, it would always be at a bar. And that very last time we hung out, I told her I'm very uncomfortable right now. I'm going to leave because I've been to bars plenty of times for reasons like a friend's happy hour, or there's karaoke there, and there's also like, Diet Coke and food or whatever, water. Um, but but this was a few years ago. But yeah, I went out with her, and I told her, you're gonna get a cab home. I'm leaving now. She's like, no, like you're taking me home. And she made this huge scene and started crying and calling me things in front of everyone. And I just realized I don't need this. You can call me anything you want. And yeah, it hurts to hear it right now, but I don't need to do anything that is going to lead me down an unhealthy path. And so I just left the bar and I never talked to her again.
Wow. So I really appreciate and respect the way that you kind of cut ties, because I find it's like in a relationship with somebody, often we can want to keep their phone number and we might text them, or we want to stay kind of connected with them. But sometimes we really do need to just do that clean break to allow both sides to just have that chance to just go off and do what's best we have to just worry about ourselves. And so I really respect that that's how you handled it.
Thank you.
Yeah. So let's get to where you are now. So after, so you did all this treatment. Tell us what age you were. How old were you when you quit? Because I think what's really powerful as well about your story is that you were somebody really young, and you of course talked about this, but so many people that are young feel like, I have to drink. How am I not going to have alcohol in my life? Everybody drinks around me. And how do I ever socialize and have parties? So how old were you again when you quit?
I had just turned 24.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going on 35 in a couple of months, which means that I will be celebrating 11 years this summer.
Amazing. Congratulations. So
Thank
did you go and start the Sobriety Collective? How long ago did that start for you?
It was in April 2015. So I am coming up on 3 years, which is crazy to think about. But yeah, it was almost 3 years ago, April. So yeah, that's in a couple months.
And it was for you, was it a way to give back? Was it a way for you to kind of get out your feelings and thoughts? What was the impetus for you starting the Sobriety Collective?
I wanted a network of sober people. I needed friends who got it. And because I wasn't going to meetings anymore, I didn't really know where to look. And, in 2015, there was quite a lot on the internet regarding recovery and sobriety, but I didn't know about it because I had always been told that we weren't supposed to talk about recovery online and things were supposed to sort of stay anonymous. And so I didn't even think to look. The only website I knew that existed was The Fix. And I would go on there, and especially I loved the pieces about sober living and just kind of like, or living sober, however they called it. So I thought that when I created this thing, which is really what I needed to connect with other people, that it was going to be like one of a kind. Well, it is one of a kind because it's me, but I thought it was just going to be like, going to blow everyone's socks off. And instead what I found was that it did wow a few people, but really it joined forces with so many other amazing people who are doing this work in a similar capacity or slightly different, which is even better because it's, we learn from each other's differences. And so it really started as a way for me to be more public about my story and to connect with other people and make friends, really. And then it just kind of grew from there.
Mm-hmm. I love it. And that's just such a big part of all of it, right? Connection, they say, is the antidote to addiction. And that's why I just love anybody that's working in the space to keep us together, to let us all know that we're not alone. And that's exactly what you're doing. I love the way that your work has evolved and shaped. And I just can't wait to see more from you, Laura. If people do want to go further with you and find you, where are the best places to find you?
A couple of things. I've been super active on Instagram compared to all of my other things. But first of all, the website is www.thesobrietycollective.com. Social media, you can find me on Twitter or at We Are Sober. So twitter.com/We Are Sober, Instagram.com/We Are Sober. But if you just go to the website, you can find all the social media links from there. And I would love to hear from anyone. I love getting messages from people, and regardless, if I've helped you, or if you have ideas for me, or just anything. I like new friends.
I love that. Well, I know you're going to be making lots of new friends, and I know you already have loads of friends, and we can always use more. So thank you so much for this time with me. I've loved every minute of it. I wish you the continued success that you deserve. You're an amazing woman with an amazing story, and just keep it up. I can't believe you were such a young girl getting sober. I mean, I was 29, but I can't, being 29, I still felt young. And yet, thinking about 24, I mean, that's really when for me, my drinking ramped up. So the fact that you knew it was a problem, you took, matters into your own hands, and you did the work, and you continue to do the work. So you're a shining example of what it means to be in recovery. I admire you. I honor you. I respect you, and I cherish you. Thank you so much for being in my life. And thank you so much, Laura, for this time together. I've loved it.
Thank you, Sarah. You're the best.
You're
Thank you
the best.
so much.
You too. You have a wonderful day. I'll talk to you soon.
Okay, talk to you soon.
Bye, honey.
Bye.
To get access to all of the free videos and interviews, visit sobrietystartshere.com.